Hey, folks, welcome to a new and bonus episode of the Whiskey Ring podcast. Today, it is that time of year. I am thrilled to welcome back on Nora and Adam from Lost Lantern Whiskey to talk about the Summer of Bourbon 2, the series from 2024, and hear all about the, nine different selections from 12 different distilleries and across 12 distilleries, 12 states across three of their ranges. So, Nora and Adam, welcome back on.
Thanks so much for having us.
Excited to be back.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So, we've got, as I said, three different collections. We got the blend series, the single distillery series, and then with one each, and then the single cask series with 7 releases in there. And so, I wanted to start with this Summer of Bourbon 2. So last year in 2023, you launched Summer of Bourbon as your first collection dedicated to a single style of whiskey, this obviously bourbon. And so as you were approaching the Summer of Bourbon 2, what kind of through line or idea were you kind of starting off from when choosing what you were going to put out?
Well, as an independent bottler of American whiskey, we've always worked with all styles of whiskey, but there's so much excitement around bourbon now, and we really think that we're getting to the spot where distilleries all across the country are putting out bourbon of a quality that we've never seen before in unique styles that are really pretty new and different than what you've traditionally seen from Kentucky, Tennessee, Indiana. And that was part of what we wanted to highlight last year, but this year we just kept seeing the same thing. There were so many distilleries that we either wanted to feature last time or we're just getting really excited about right now that we're like, first Summer of Bourbon went well, people were excited about it. Why don't we do it again and do a whole new range of distilleries? And I think it's not only our biggest collection ever, but the most new distilleries that we've ever had in one collection since our very first release.
Yeah. And there were a lot of other firsts. Our first Ghost Distillery, our first finished bourbon. We also had our first Tennessee whiskey, which we think is a subset of bourbon, which we can argue with anyone about if they want to. But we just had so much more to say coming out of Summer of Bourbon 1. In some ways, looking at it, we were so glad we did it. And we felt like it only scratched the surface of American bourbon. So we were, this is not going to be an annual release. There will be no Summer of Bourbon 3 next year. We may bring it back at some point. But we thought we really needed to do it again because there was so much more going on that we could highlight.
I should say from all of these that I've gotten to taste, and number one, thank you for sharing them for tasting and reviewing purposes. From all of them, I had been saying over the last couple of months, I'd gotten kind of tired of bourbon in a way. Like I was saying the same notes over and over again. And it didn't mean they weren't bad. It didn't mean they weren't good products. It was just, how many times can you write the same notes of brown sugar, vanilla, baking spices? But these really broke the mold for me in many ways. And some were adjacent to those, but others just went way off. And that was fun. And it was exciting, and nothing is better from my standpoint than something that's exciting and that breaks you out of the mold a little bit. So I do want to start off with what I think is personally my favorite, coolest thing, which is this Ghost Distillery.
Yeah.
When I came up to visit you guys in February, I got to see the barrels. I'm not sure if we mentioned it when you came on for last season's the Midwest, but if not, you mentioned now I got to see the barrels, and I was like, this is awesome. We don't see many ghost distilleries in the US now. It's not like Scotland. And this is something that closed in 2020. It's not like it closed in 2023 or even earlier this year. It's been closed for a while. Bourbon's just sitting there, still aging. Stuff is 5 years old, or I should say the single distillery series blend is 5 years old. I think you have some stuff that's even older in there as well. And this is all from Rich Grain Distilling, which was in Mississippi. And there's also not a lot of distilleries in Mississippi, deep south.
Oh, yeah.
So just let's start with, how you came across this stash.
Yeah. I mean, we were really excited to to do our first Ghost Distillery release too, even though the whole story behind it is unfortunate. But we came across it through a lot of serendipity. My job as the head of whiskey sourcing is to find unique things, and most times that takes the form of traveling around and visiting distilleries. But I happened to be looking at the ADI forums, the American Distilling Institute, and saw this guy just like some like generic username that I wasn't familiar with, like post like, hey, I unfortunately am selling off the whiskey that I made from the distillery that I closed a couple years ago. If anyone's interested in it, reach out. And I like emailed him like 2 or 3 different emails that I was able to dig up. I'm a journalist. I'm pretty good at finding people's contact information, even if they don't make it public. Like you can.
Yeah. You were so intrigued by the idea of Mississippi bourbon that you just had to find him.
Yeah. And I was like, I have the only other place that I know that is making bourbon in Mississippi is Cathead. And they also do a lot of sourcing, and they're still very much a going concern and are exciting. But I was so curious what else there could be down there. And I ended up like finding his phone number somehow, probably on like his original application for the distillery license, and just cold called him, which like, I'm a journalist. It does not mean I like cold calling people. Not the most fun thing to do, especially when it's someone who you've never spoken to before. But super nice guy. I think played phone tag for a while, but eventually was just like, hey, we're an independent bottler. We're interested in showcasing what you were doing. Like, we're not buying this just to have whiskey for our own brand. We want to tell the story of what you were doing with Rich Grain Distilling and what you're trying to do by making a true Mississippi bourbon. And he sent us some samples and a handwritten note with lots of details on all of them. And ultimately we ended up going for the whole lot. And we're really excited that we did. It was definitely we thought the whiskey was super interesting. It's as you've tasted, it's like it's hazmat. Most of the barrels that we got were hazmat or close to it. And very tannic in some cases, but still like a totally unique style of whiskey that you don't see even from Tennessee, which is not that much farther north, but it's so humid in Mississippi.
Right, the climate there is so unique, and it makes such a unique bourbon. Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I mean, before this, I was not aware of any Mississippi distilleries. And as you mentioned, Adam, Cadet came up. There was one, I'm forgetting the name right now, but that just broke ground a couple of months ago in the Delta region. That's going to be some, it's pretty large. It's a $16-17 million project. But overall, I mean, as you talk Gulf Coast states, there really are not many. Maybe there's a few in Houston, 1 or 2 in obviously New Orleans. You got Sazerac down there, but even West Coast of Florida, there's not a ton of distilleries in that region. And part of it, I would imagine, is the climate. I would imagine it's almost hard to age things there because it's so humid that everything's going to go hazmat pretty quickly. And there's also, vestiges of prohibition, both religious, social reasons why certain states, Alabama, for example, I think you couldn't distill there until 2015 or something. So after prohibition. So with Mississippi, Adam, you said when you guys got samples, and it's really for both of you, when you got samples, that this tasted totally different. So in your words, what notes really popped as like, this is not only, it's bourbon, but it's not only different and it's Mississippi?
To me, the dominant, like the first thing that I get from all of our rich grain barrels is like Black Forest cake. So like dense chocolate cherry, but like there's almost a rum-like sweetness to it around the edges. There's like a funk to it that I don't get in a lot of bourbon that's not from some like really hot climate. And I suspect it's because it's hot and humid that there around the edges, there's this funk that like makes it truly unique in my mind. But there's also like that cherry note is there throughout all of it.
Interesting that you say Black Forest cake, because to me it's adjacent but slightly different, which is like chocolate lava cake, but have that same kind of
more gooey, even more gooey. Yeah. But like I feel like we're in the same family. I mean, we're both going cake, which for the two of us, if we're in the same like even baked good category, that's saying something. Because our palates are so different. We can a lot of times we'll agree, but we'll get somewhat different tasting notes out of it. So the fact that we're both in chocolate cake land says something. Yeah.
I definitely think I got the same thing, this dense chocolate, deep cocoa, almost verging slightly on bitter, but in a good way. Like I really liked it. It wasn't overly sweet, and we know bourbon can be very sweet, especially when you get
Yeah.
that real concentrated stuff.
Yeah.
But no, the dark bitterness, and then Nora, I'm with you on this one. I did get a little more kind of cherry or red fruit-ish on there.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that
I
was nice
think,
as well, just to balance
yeah.
the bitterness, sweetness, and also the proof of hazmat level, just to cut it a little bit. And it was beautiful mix.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We also, so Mississippi Memory is single distillery series, which means for people that don't know what that means to us, it means that we've blended multiple barrels together from one distillery to highlight the distillery, but to show it through the Lost Lantern lens. And one of the things that we've done with, because they're 15 and 30 gallon barrels that we bought from them, that were quite tannic when we got them, which like can be very interesting for a certain palate, but especially for Mississippi Memory, we wanted to mellow that and let the underlying spirit sing. So what we actually did is we married a number of 15-gallon barrels together and put them in 53, used 53s from other things that we've dumped in the past.
All ex-bourbon.
All ex-bourbon. And we let those marry, and it kind of softened it and brought out more cherry to it across the different bourbon barrels. And I think pulling a little bit of that tannic structure back into the barrel allowed us a little bit more kind of runway to play with our blending for this. And we were able to bring out cherry in the process. And that was something that like we actively talked about bringing out during the blending process. We wanted it to, at 140 proof, to be more accessible than some of the barrels can be by themselves. That being, and for now, this is the only way that people can taste this distillery. We are doing some private barrels with the whiskey. A couple of clubs and stores have picked single barrels from Rich Grain, but from Lost Lantern, for now, the only way to taste it is through Mississippi Memory.
It's awesome. And I'm curious because I hadn't thought of this technique. So tannins for me are like tannins and woodiness are the number one thing I don't like in whiskey. And with the climate and all that, you can definitely get that. This idea of rebarreling to blend in larger used casks. Well, I say larger from what you had, but normal 53 size casks.
Yes.
Was this something that you had a technique you had used before, or that you learned from someone, or was it just kind of experimentation and it worked?
So this was something that no one had ever done before in our group, and no one had told us to do this, but this is actually an idea from Ryan, who's our production person, where he was saying, hey, like, this is worth trying. I mean, it's not going to hurt it. Generally, it'll continue what it's doing, but like maybe at least I think initially the hypothesis was we wanted to continue interacting with oxygen, but we don't want to pour more wood out. What we didn't know when we popped it into the larger barrels is it would actually bring the tannins down. At the time, we were so focused on not wanting it to become more tannic. And it makes sense when you think about it because the barrel works as a filter, but we just didn't know that it was going to be so effective in pulling some of those tannins that some people love, but like I too find them physically less desirable. Like I can feel it on my tongue and I don't really want that experience. But yeah, it was one of those where like an initial hypothesis turned into something that was even better than we were initially thinking.
It's a really great outcome. I hope that some other brands will take note of that, because you've had some, the industry has had some great bourbons and rye and American whiskeys recently that have great flavor, but it just needs to take that tannin out. If that's a way that it can make it happen, hey, all for it. Give it a shot. And it doesn't change the category. It doesn't change anything else. So, hey, why not?
Yeah, we've been telling other people about it too, and because we kind of think the same thing, that like maybe this is a way that, like, we've worked with several whiskeys that were aged in smaller barrels before. We tend to prefer things that are in 53s in general, but we've had good things in small barrels, and we wonder if this is a way to make some of those even better. We look forward to continuing to play with it here and hopefully getting some other people to try it too. And at the same time, we still wanted it to be a whiskey that still reflected what the underlying whiskey had been like when we got it, and still reflected the founder, David Rich's original vision. So it didn't change it all that much. It just kind of took off, like brought the tannins down a little bit. Because the goal for this for us, like we felt a certain responsibility in doing our first ghost distillery release. Like the founder, he got it going. It was actually the first bourbon ever released in Mississippi, that was made in Mississippi, and was like we took that seriously, that he had to shut the distillery down shortly after COVID, kept the barrels aging there for in the building for a couple more years until we bought it. But especially because there's no other way people can ever try it, we really wanted to make sure it'd be something that he would be proud of too, and recognize that this is what he had been doing, just getting it out to a bigger audience than he was able to.
Fantastic. And so there's a lot more to talk about with that distillery. I will pause on it just because we have a couple other products that we have to talk about, or that we want to talk about for sure. But it is a good transition point. So this is going into the blend series. So the Lost Lantern Far Flung Bourbon 2, which has 5 component distilleries, one of which is Rich Grain Distilling Company. And you also have in there Kings County Distillery from New York, Starlight Distillery from Indiana, Smooth Ambler from West Virginia, and Wallersheim from Wisconsin. Now, of those 5, I know Kings County also started out with smaller barrels. I know that now they're mostly in 53s, but for a while they had a lot of 30-gallon barrels. And I know you've also used 30 gallons from them in the past. So that's not to, like I said, I'm still getting back on track, so my thought process is a little slow.
Yeah.
So you have the different size casks here, and to me that provides a connection point. Whether other people see it, I don't know. I'll leave it to them. But anyway, the Far Flung Bourbon 2. Far Flung Bourbon 2. So obviously this is the second edition. You had the Far Flung Bourbon 1 that came out as the Summer of Bourbon 1 last year. And this is at 126.68 proof, 697 bottles, minimum age 5 years. So with the blend series, now this, and correct me if I'm wrong, the blending series tends to be a competition between the two of you.
It can be, yeah.
So was this one collaborative or competitive?
It is becoming less of a competition because Nora just always wins. So she is, especially for the multi-distillery blends, like we both work on blending the single distillery series. And those kind of vary per person, who did which one, or whether we did it collaboratively. For the blend series, you're usually taking the lead now because you're just better at it. It's hard
my instincts
flavors from different distilleries like that.
I think neither of us have a blending background. We just have very trained palates, and we usually defer to palates, but it's so far my instincts about what will do well together are better than his. It may not long-term be the case, but generally the blends are much more efficient when I do them, and I can usually get us in the right direction relatively quickly, and then it's tweaking from there. But so far, we've defaulted to, by and large, I'm doing the multi-distillery blends, and then the single distillery series is usually, we now have a blend captain, so who's in charge nominally, but like still we both have to say yes to everything. But it's nice to have one person who's really driving it. And so that's more mixed depending on the distillery and who's excited, like more excited about the blending process for that specific distillery.
And you're also here more. So I'm on the road a lot, and it makes it hard to, it's hard to blend when you're in North Dakota and the facility is in Vermont. So it makes more sense for you to do that. But for Far Flung Bourbon 2, similar idea to the first one, we wanted to create a whiskey that is in some ways a nod to all the great blends of bourbon from Kentucky, Tennessee, and Indiana, like bringing multiple distilleries together, but playing with totally different distilleries than you normally would see, and from states and distilleries that have never been blended before. Like we say Far Flung Bourbon 2 aims to reflect in one bottle that great bourbon now comes from all across the country. Obviously, great stuff comes from Kentucky, Tennessee, Indiana, but other places too. And this, as you noted, this even has some Indiana bourbon in it. It's just from Starlight, not from MGP. And I thought that's kind of a fun nod, because if people see Indiana, they usually make an assumption, but says all the distilleries right on the front label, so we can't got nothing to hide there.
And in truth, it's generally the best bourbon that we can make with what's currently in our inventory. So that Starlight that's in that, we actually pulled out of our spring Starlight single cask. And I may or may not have gotten in trouble with this guy over here for wanting to use a little bit in the blend. But it made a difference to pull. I forget exactly how many gallons, but it did decrease the size of the Starlight single cask in our spring collection. But the distilleries featured the proof, the underlying mash bill. It's obviously bourbon, but those vary batch to batch just based off of what we currently have in our inventory. So totally different distilleries between batch 1 and batch 2. Batch 3 is actually in a tote right now, and it has some distilleries from 1 and 2, and then some new distilleries as well. So it evolves as what we're doing at Lost Lantern evolves, and it evolves as the distilleries we're working with changes as well. But people should expect that the level of quality is consistent as we go between batches.
And you kind of answered this in part just now, but I'll ask it anyway, which is that of the 5 that are in here right now of Far Flung Bourbon 2, 4 of them you had worked with before, either putting out single casks, single distillery series, or they'd been using other blends, and it's Starlight, Kings County, Smooth Ambler, and Wallersheim. Rich Grain is the new one for this, just as, you know, it's not only in the blend, but it's the first time you have the single distillery series as well.
Yeah.
So it's, as you're doing these particular blends, do you find that you, and as the third one is in the tote right now, do you tend towards starting with ones that you're more familiar with as opposed to the newer ones? Or do you kind of go at it from a blank slate?
Blank slate for me, I taste everything and I start sorting them into who I think is going to play well together, and then go from there. Like often there's a trio of whiskeys that seem like it's a good place to start, and that will go from there, or the blending process will go from there. So it's usually like we start from zero and we taste the barrels as they are. Generally there's a little bit of evolution, especially like for barrels where we pulled a half barrel previously, those are going to go through more evaporation than other barrels do. So we always start from, this is what we currently have in our inventory, and go from there.
Well, you're the blend captain, but I still feel like there's usually a few barrels where you have a sense in the beginning that they're probably going to be a portion of the base for it. Like some whiskeys tend to like work better as the underlying component that you start with. And like if we use the Kings County or the Rich Grain or something like that as like a majority portion of it, it would end up tasting mostly like Kings County or Rich Grain or whichever one it was. It wouldn't be something that's distinctive on its own. So having something that you can, like, we subscribe to a blending philosophy around like a pyramid where you have like A as the base, like one that's like a little larger than the rest. Usually a relatively approachable bourbon for cast strength.
Which was Smooth Ambler for batch 2.
Yeah. And then you layer in something like a little bit less than that of things that like pull the flavor in a certain direction. And then at the very top, you have some that you only put a little bit of in it. That's kind of like the salt and pepper that brings it all together, which that was the Rich Grain of the Kings County for this one,
this
right?
one. Yeah.
It makes sense. And as the rollout was happening for this Summer of Bourbon 2, I know a call was put out by you both to people who were tasting it to compare Far Flung Bourbon 1 and Far Flung Bourbon 2. I'm curious, as we are approaching end of summer, which scares me, but we're approaching end of summer. What has the response been so far?
It's interesting. I feel like people always have different perceptions than we do. Like to me, Far Flung Bourbon 2 is a more traditional bourbon than Far Flung Bourbon 1. And a lot of the feedback that we got from people was the other way around. That Far Flung Bourbon 1, which was like 137 proof, and to me is like super fruity, like a very Western influenced bourbon, because a lot of it comes from mountain states. To me feels less traditional, but that's not how people have been perceiving it. So that's interesting to me.
But by and large, the feedback is that people like 2 more than 1.
or can't decide.
or can't decide, which is the direction that we want.
Yeah.
We when we were deciding if we were done, what we do for that and what we'll do going forward is you blind taste it against the other ones. And if there's one that's consistently worse and it's the new one, then you're not done. But like the idea is to not have a sense of which is which, and try to see if we can pick out which is three in any way. And if we think it's much better, then that's great. But if we're consistently seeing too much of a difference from that, in that we can always pick it out of the blind lineup, then we'll keep blending.
Well, we don't want each batch to be the same. We in fact explicitly want them to be different and not consistent, but as Nora said before, consistent in quality level, but slightly different flavor profile each time. So we don't think Far Flung Bourbon 2 is like better than Far Flung Bourbon 1 or worse. It's just, to us, it's different. And I think I swing back and forth which one I like better.
Yeah.
There, like, we could do an entire episode just on your blending styles and abilities and how you go about it. But just in the interest of hitting the single cast series, I wanted to do one last question about the blend, the Far Flung Bourbon 2, which can be for this particular product, but also your process, which is when you're blending, you said you use that pyramid structure to build it. Knowing that you, in some cases, might only have a barrel or two of this whiskey to work with in any particular case, what volume are you able to go to on the blending side before you say, like, look, we're just using too much to try to make this work in a blend?
I mean, unless it's earmarked for something else, I give myself space to use all of it. We'll use full barrels. We'll use multiple barrels from a distillery. The nice thing for us about having more like structured releases now with clear reasons to exist and stories about what we're talking about, like Summer of Bourbon, like Midwest collection, is I have a good sense of, if it's not earmarked for release in the next year, basically I get to play with it. And sometimes even if it is earmarked in the next year, I usually try not to take more than a quarter of the cask. But if it's a cask that is either available for private barrels or just we wanted to have it, then that is mine to play with.
And a lot of times we know that when we buy the barrels, that like when we bought barrels from Wallersheim we knew the first one would be for our spring collection for the Midwest. But we bought several barrels, and we knew that at least one of the bourbons and ryes that we bought from them would be for Far Flung Bourbon 2 and for Far Flung Rye, if they worked, or if they fit in with it, or that they would be for a future blending project. Like, they're whiskeys that stand well on their own, but also ones that tasted like they would probably play well with others, which ended up being the case.
It's a good point. For a lot of distilleries, we're buying both single cask and blend stock as well.
Awesome. Well, with that, let's move into the single cask series. So for this year, you had 7 release. Sorry, this year, I mean this Summer of Bourbon series. You had 7 single casks. And I really hope my microphone is okay with the plosives on that, because there are a lot of S's in there. So you had 7 from Corbin Cash in California, Woodinville in Washington, Union Horse in Kansas, Highwire in South Carolina, Leaper's Fork in Tennessee, Rocktown in Arkansas, and Boulder Spirits in Colorado. Now, most of these, you had used some product from these other distilleries at one point or another, either in a single cask or single distillery series. I'm thinking, Corbin Cash, you had that rye from, was that earlier this year or last year? The rye.
Last year.
Last year. That was a huge hit. Boulder Spirits, I've got the peated cask, the hazmat peated cask at my desk right now. I know Woodinville's been a partner of yours as well.
No, this is our first.
Oh, this is the first?
Yeah.
So Boulder and Corbin are the only returning partners for the single casks. The other 5 are new with this collection.
I must be confused. I could have sworn Woodinville. Maybe I'm thinking of something else, like something else with a W, a Westward or Westland.
We've done like at least 4, maybe 5 distilleries that start with W at this point.
Fair,
2
yeah.
of which are in Washington. So
so it's not helping my memory. That's all right. All good. All right. So So in that case, then the Corbin Cash and the Boulder Spirits being the only two returnees. Now, and like I said, the first two of those were very successful. And Corbin Cash, I'll actually be speaking to David Souza in a couple of weeks
Nice.
to them. So really look forward to that. And Boulder Spirits is going to be on my list as well, because Colorado Spirits, I'll be honest, for me, Colorado Spirits is one of those states where it's very dichotomous. Like I either love or hate the distilleries for whatever reason. And Boulder firmly is on that line of I really like it. And I was introduced to them by trying the cask that you guys had. So so with that, then I guess let's focus on the newcomers then, because hey, they're new for Lost Lantern at least. And honestly, a lot of these are going to be new for people who taste them anyway, because they're smaller distilleries. They're off the beaten path, other than Leaper's Fork being in Tennessee. And I know they're kind of on the border in Tennessee too. You know, none of these are from major, you know, big five producing states, let's say. So I actually want to start off with the Rocktown. So, you know, we got Arkansas, just north of Mississippi. And so still some of that humidity is not quite as bad as I've heard, but you know, still plenty of humidity, plenty of heat, a very different climate than Kentucky, Tennessee, Indiana, and even New York, frankly. So with Rocktown, I think when I spoke with you last year, Adam, you were just heading down to visit them.
That sounds right. Yeah.
Yeah, and see.
March, so it's probably like right after, right before you visited.
Yes, yeah, and you know, you had great things to say. It sounded like something was imminent to happen, and here we have with it. And I'll be honest, I like to stand behind the brands that I really like and support, and Rocktown was one of the bottles that I bought a full one after trying it because it was just that good, that different. And Rocktown was a distillery that's been on my radar for probably 5-6 years at this point, definitely pre-COVID, and I just never had a chance to really taste them. I'm sure you know they don't have a ton of distribution. They're not massive. They're well established in Arkansas. They've been around for a decade, but it's just not something that you see in a lot of places. So, what brought you to them initially? What got them on your radar?
I think one of the interesting things about them is that, as you say, they're not very well known across the country, at least right now, because they don't have much distribution. But they have quite a reputation. From about 10 years ago. They won some really big awards at that time, and then they actually were one of the very first, if not the first, American craft distillery to start to be quote unquote collected by Scottish independent bottlers that were playing in the US market. So if you're familiar with, which I know you are, with the SMWS numbering system, Rocktown is bourbon number 3. So after Heaven Hill and I forget what the other one is. But like there've been, I think, more than 10 SMWS bottlings of Rocktown over the years, and a few other independent bottlers have done things with them too. So they've really found an audience over there, and that was interesting to us as an independent bottler. Like, what is going on? We got to get down there and see what's up. And I visited this year, and it's a unique climate. It is like the inland portion of the Deep South. And they definitely consider it part of the Deep South, at least the people I talked to there. And Phil Brandon, the founder there, is a multi-generation, part of a multi-generation Arkansas family, and wanted to create something that was made with Arkansas grown grain and really reflected the agriculture of the state. And we were so curious about that. Once we got down there, we just thought it's so different than most of what we see, even though it's not that far from Tennessee, but just a different kind of product and climate. So we're excited to showcase that.
Yeah. And still, yet in that hot climate, it's more delicate than a lot of the other hot climate whiskey that we've put out. And that's fascinating to us as well. Like, it's lower proof. It's not a monster like we're used to, like the Mississippi Memory. And so I think it gives people a different access point to what he does to whiskey. And I like, we love that. We love when climate does interesting things to whiskey. And that's part of what this full summer collection allows people to do, is actually taste the differences. When you're tasting bourbon, multiple bourbons from one distillery, you don't get that in a collection that spans the entire country, you do get a chance to see what it means to be in a place like Little Rock.
And it's also interesting just to see how each distillery is situated in where it's based. Like we probably haven't even really talked about this, but it became very clear when I visited that Rocktown Distillery is probably one of the 2 or 3 best cocktail bars in Little Rock. Like they have they're right downtown. They have like a quite a large bar set up and a full range of cocktails, and like doing very, very high end mixology in the city that I think that like you as a New Yorker and me and us as former New Yorkers would not necessarily have guessed from that part of the country, but it's there. There are people who love it just as much as we do. And it's cool to see that being attached to a distillery, pushing the boundaries of that. And I think that may be a piece of why that they're not available across the country, is because they do really well in Arkansas. So that's taken them a long way. Although they did last year launch a column still collection that they had. They used Arkansas grain and had it distilled for them at Bardstown. So they put that out under a separate line to be able to do something that's a little bit more widely available.
The 2 things really popped out there for me. One, them being a downtown distillery. But I want to jump back also to this idea that a lot of independent bottlers, and particularly Scottish independent bottlers, have picked up on them. I mean, this is, I know they've been doing bourbons in general, like a Cadenheads or somewhere will come over and pick a bourbon barrel from Heaven Hill. And it's just the bottle that I'm looking up at on my shelf right now. But, the Rocktown, as you said, it's a smaller distillery. It's not well known. Someone's not going to go to the SMWS website and go there knowing maybe that it's like the 3rd distillery that they work with here for that. And to that end too, it's using, as I said, Arkansas grain and especially corn. And it's a high corn mash bill. Talking, I think it's 83% corn, something like that.
82, yeah,
82, yeah, 82% corn, which, I mean, if you're used to drinking malt, that's quite a shift, let alone that it's not a classic, quote unquote, classic bourbon profile.
Right.
So that's a rabbit hole that we could go down for sure. We'll probably hold off on that for now, but I just wanted to point out that that's interesting. And now we got to look up what number 2 is, because I know one, yeah, as you said, one is Heaven Hill, and got to find out what number 2 is. Anyway, the second part being that it's a downtown distillery, and I too find that fascinating when you have a distillery that's really in town. And I know you both being former New Yorkers, and you'll always be honorary New Yorkers, well, and especially from Brooklyn, like the distilleries that we love in Brooklyn, we love them, but they're all on the edge. They're in the industrial zones.
Right.
Takes a while to get there. I mean, the closest one to kind of centrality, I would have said would have been New York Distilling Company, and now they're in Bushwick, which is further out. So, and then let alone Hudson Valley, where you have to go north. So when you find an in-city distillery, there's something very different about that. And I was talking recently to the family Jones in Colorado, where they're also very centrally located. They do a lot of business with the bar, with mixology. They're in a state, I'm not sure if Arkansas is like this, but Colorado is, where you have to make all of your own bitters and amaros and all these things. Anything alcoholic you put into a cocktail, you have to make yourself. So with it being a downtown distillery and doing such great business in Arkansas itself, to your knowledge, I mean, are they looking to expand and get more distribution, or are they happy owning their backyard and then having people like you in Lost Lantern kind of have pops out in the market, flashes that get people's attention to say, hey, you should pay attention to this, even if it's hard to get?
I think that they probably want to grow a little bit, and that's why they did the partnership with Bardstown and get out there at least a little bit more. But I think they've been around for long enough now that clearly they've made it through a few ups and downs in the market, so have figured out what works well for them. But I know that Phil, the founder, certainly likes the attention from the independent bottlers, not just us, but the ones overseas. And also, it was very easy to work with because he's like, "Yeah, I've been doing things like this for a long time now. I know exactly how to do it, and I don't have to ship it to the UK this time."
And just in the interest of this, I want to bring up the let's see, was this the notes that I sent? So Rocktown in particular, like I said, it was I should start. Are there any bottles of this left?
Yes.
Okay, good. Then I will definitely waste the time then to say what I'm going to say, because if not, then that's just teasing. So I got to try all of these products, of course, but a couple of them really did stand out, and Rocktown was one of them. And for me, I compared them to the famous dish from Massimo Bottura, the 5 Ages of Parmesan. And it's this dish that was created because they had an earthquake in Italy and all the Parmesan fell off the racks and they couldn't re-rack it. So they had to sell it, or it was going to be like 200,000 wheels of Parm that were going to go bad. And because of this dish and his advocacy, they sold them all. It's craziness. It's a great story. One of those shows, Chef's Table or something, picked it up. It was great to watch. But the point being that, and I've gotten to visit his restaurant and have the dish, which is even better. So this Rocktown straight bourbon to me was just that, but swap out the Parmesan for corn. It hit all these notes. It evolved throughout the course of the pour over and over and over to hit different parts of, roasted, fresh off the cob, walking through a cornfield, caramelized, even boiled to an extent where just the sweetness and the kind of, you just get butter on there and a little bit of pepper. And to me, it kept it interesting. It was totally different. It leaned into the corn. It said, "We're not afraid to be a bourbon. We want you to know it's a bourbon," and that is 82% Arkansas corn. And I ended the notes by saying it's one that makes me want to learn more and taste more about the distillery, and that's the highest compliment I can give a whiskey. And it's also a distillery I've just slept on them far too long, so I'll have to definitely follow up, and that may be one that we'll have on as well, because they're just, from this, they're knocking it out of the park. And I'm able to trust you both because I know your palates well enough that if you pick a cask, it's going to be representative, and that's a big thing to talk about. So I know I just talked a lot on that one, but
I love it. Yeah.
It's so Rocktown, Arkansas, there are still bottles available. Definitely pick it up. It's $90. The shipping is definitely worth it. Honestly, not to shade other independent bottlers, but there are some that are, the warehouse is 10 minutes from my apartment and it costs $35 a bottle and it drives me nuts. So thank you for not doing that. But it's, at $90, it's tied for the lowest price of these releases from Summer of Bourbon 2 with Union Horse and the Mississippi Memory. So definitely it is worth a shot. It is for a bourbon that's going to make you not tired of bourbon anymore and kind of reawaken that for you. So with that, we'll jump over to Highwire.
Now we're something completely different. Yeah.
Completely different. So before I was trying to do a segue. Now we're just going to go non sequitur and completely different. So Highwire, South Carolina, straight bourbon, single cask. This one's a 117.4 proof, age minimum of 3 years. Now, it's another state that is not well known for whiskey. I would argue Carolinas in general, the Low Country, not known for their whiskey, just like the Gulf Coast. And that could be a mix of, I don't know, state laws that well down there of, making it hard to distill, or it could be just, owning your backyard and limits. But Highwire has been a distillery that's been around for a while. They've been around for a little over a decade. And so what, again, I go back to that question of what made you look in South Carolina for a potential bourbon?
Well, this was a case where we were not so much looking at South Carolina as we were looking at Highwire in particular. Yeah. And I really wanted to get barrels from them for the first Summer of Bourbon. And we couldn't pull it off at that time, but we were able to get it for this one. But But I think what you say is true about the Carolinas and about the South in general. And one thing that we've noticed is that a lot of the distilleries there started a little bit later than they did in other parts of the country. So in the Northwest, a lot of the distilleries we work with started in like between 2008 2010. The ones in the South started like maybe 2013 to 2015, or even a little later than that. And part of that is like regional legislation, and part of it is like just culture and the local demand for it. But it's taken that area like a little bit longer to be putting out whiskey at the same ages that we're seeing from elsewhere. So this is why this is our first collection that really has a lot of whiskey from the South. But Highwire is doing like exactly what I love to see a regional distillery doing, which is creating something that could only ever be made in South Carolina. This is it is what I would call a high corn bourbon, being that it's 100% corn, and made entirely from heirloom corn, and an heirloom that is traditionally grown in South Carolina that nearly went extinct. There were only 3 years left of it when it started being cultivated again. Harvested the kernels off of it, and now it's a bright red corn called Jimmy Red, and now is grown entirely for them on a single farm in South Carolina. And it's their way of both creating a product that could only be grown there, but also supporting local farmers and paying them far more than they could make for growing corn and selling it off to commodity producers. And then
and it's an heirloom corn that can support 100% that corn. There's enough complexity because 100% corn whiskey, when it's yellow dent, I mean, I like mellow corn. I think it's a fun thing to have, not the most complex or interesting whiskey. And so generally, with some exceptions, one being Iron Root, who also plays with heirloom corn, and these guys at Highwire, like you need some nuance to the flavor profile, and for it to be 100% corn, by and large, what we found is you need heirloom corn involved to provide enough complexity to support something at cask strength and honestly at the price point that is required in order to make a whiskey that's 100% heirloom.
Yeah, heirloom corn from a single farm is expensive compared to yellow dent corn, which you can buy by the bushel for I don't know how much, but I'm gonna look it up.
Yeah,
it was to me, I totally agree. The 100% corn, it's a risk. It's absolutely a risk. There's nowhere to hide. There's nothing to put in other variables like you would do in a blend of the different, pyramids. I shouldn't say pyramid schemes. It's the wrong word to use there, but the different pyramid structures that you could use. And something that kind of struck my eye was that, the Jimmy Red, it's obviously, as it sounds, it's a red corn. And the other kind of red corn that people think about is probably Bloody Butcher.
Yeah, of course.
And without any shade or anything like that to any other distillery, with Bloody Butcher, I find it's kind of a paper tiger. Like there's a lot of color and fanfare about it, but it doesn't actually have a ton of flavor on its own. At least maybe not a flavor that aligns to my palate, let's say. But the Jimmy Red did. I mean, it was huge flavor in there. Everything from, it was fruity. There were coffee notes in there, milk, dark chocolate, caramel, popcorn, pepper spice. It was, and a really nice barrel char effect in there. So this was just another pour that just evolved over the course of the pour and the sip. And Adam, you and I were talking, and I was trying to remember because I had Highwire, some product of theirs. We won't mention which one it was a while ago, and I was like, I don't remember liking it. Like it was, and I knew like it was early in my journey. It was like 2018 or something. I was like, I don't think I like that product, but hell, I'm always willing to try it. And to me, and for me, this also represents this idea of you need to retaste distilleries. Yeah. With craft distilleries in particular, you could say this for the big guys too, but especially craft, 3 years in a craft distillery is a lifetime, let alone 6 years.
Yeah.
So much evolves, so much can change until they find their stride. And then even when they find their stride, they could still be making better and better and better. So when you look at a distillery like this, or any distillery that has grown and evolved over a couple of years, do you start thinking about like, maybe we should go back to them in a couple of years and see what's that's going to be like in another 3 years.
Yes.
Yeah. We explicitly have a list of places where, especially when we did our initial road trip, there are some distilleries we visited that maybe only had opened like 2 years before. Like we visited Andalusia Distillery in Blanco, Texas, less than 2 years after they launched. And we were like, they've only been going for about 2 years, but like, this is going to be really good once it's out there. And now we've worked with them now, and it is really, everything they make is really good. But we literally keep a list of places like where it's like, okay, we need to revisit this in a year or two and see where it's at.
Yeah. And even for current partners, for us, these are long-term partnerships. So our expectation by and large is if we work with the distillery once and everyone likes the experience, that we will continue working with them in some capacity. So we keep in pretty close contact with the distilleries that are part of what we've done so far.
So are there, and this could be of the single cast series that we're looking at right now, or others that you have in the bank, so to speak, other, one or two other distilleries that you really think like you keep an eye on this one that you need to look at, or is that pulling the carpet back a little too far?
I'll give you one. There's a distillery, it's not in this group, but there's a distillery near Asheville, North Carolina, called Oak and Grist, which is making wonderful single malt that reminds me of Lowland single malt. And that's not something I've really seen in the US before. And when I visited, the whiskey that they were putting out was really, really good already. They just had very, very little of it because it was still in the early ramp up stage, and only had a few barrels that were fully mature. But it's been on our list for a while, and it's exactly the kind of place where I'm like, nobody out, like it's not something that is widely talked about yet outside of like North Carolina because they're pretty small, but like this is going to be a big deal down the road, and we like to keep an eye on places like that.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I'll have to keep an eye on them too. Again, Carolinas. I mean, they're just areas of the country that we know they have a lot of good distilleries, and we gravitate to them. And I love the idea of exposing us to new states and new climates. So we got Mississippi, we got Carolina, and I think and Arkansas, and you've also got Kansas in this mix. So dead center, as landlocked as you can get in the U.S. And you have Union Horse, Kansas straight bourbon single cask. This is at 119.9 proof, age minimum 5 years, and as we said before, it's $90 MSRP. So Kansas is the wheat basket of America. It grows more wheat than any other state. It's just what a lot of stuff is made from there. But this is a straight bourbon, so it's still using the 51% corn. What popped out about Union Horse that said, okay, we're going to add Kansas into this mix too, as a new climate, new state, and all of that?
Well, so Union Horse, we actually visited in our great road trip, and we hadn't really heard of them before, but you obviously discovered them, but they were one of the distilleries that as we were driving around the US, they came up. And we've been talking to them since then, but things like the pandemic came up and it just took us a while. So they have been on our radar for a long time, and we've wanted to work with them. And this was the perfect opportunity as we were thinking about Summer of Bourbon 2 to really say, okay, guys, let's do this now. It's time. Like, we want a Kansas bourbon. We think it's distinct enough from what else we have. It's 80% corn, 20% rye, so it's also a very interesting mash bill. Like, it's cool to have this range of climates and also just choices when it comes to what grain you're putting into your whiskey. So all of that made it, I think, a really interesting comparison point to the other ones that we've already talked about.
Yeah, and they're also a relatively large distillery for craft size, like not compared to like a Kentucky craft player like New Riff, but they're doing at least they're doing a pretty solid amount, enough to at least be a well-known regional brand that also like people like us would all know about and seek out. It's they worked with Dave Pickerel when they were founded. He helped them get their setup there, as did Woodinville. and really are very honed in on what they're doing. And it's just, I feel like it's has some regional and national recognition, but not as much as it should have. So we were excited to highlight them.
Yeah.
So what does that Kansas terroir, if you will, add to the bourbon?
Well, I visited them again early this year, and one of the things that they kept on telling me is that Kansas is part of the Midwest, at least as far as they're concerned. And I always thought that like this is more like the Great Plains. They're like, no, Kansas, especially Kansas City, this is the Midwest, and it has a Midwest climate, but slightly warmer than Iowa or Illinois, obviously. And I think it does have some of the same trends that we saw in our Midwest collection, which this probably could very well have fit into that as well. And it's a climate that has relatively big temperature swings throughout the year, cold winters, warm to hot, humid summers, and that leads to a lot of barrel interaction. And also, I don't think this really affects the whiskey, but it certainly affects the people. It's so windy in that part of the country.
It's interesting because it's one of our more classic flavor profiles, despite all of that. Like when it comes to like it all of that being said, a slightly non-standard mash bill, a different climate, but I think there's a combination of the creaminess of the cool climate that they do have, and also in the summer, in the warmth, you get more of a classic kind of oak interaction, not so crazy like Mississippi or other hot climates, that all of those kind of non-standard things come together to be one of the more standard tasting bourbons, which is fascinating in its own right, where it's almost a like 1 + 1 + 1 = 5. Like, who knew that this would come together and work in this way? So it was also an important comparison point, because we like having some more standard tasting bourbon, because that creates the ability to have that array and understand kind of what people expect, and then why something is different from that, or why something is similar to that. So it was an important part of that overall kind of landscape that we were showcasing.
And I think it's notable. It's 119.9 proof. It's not a lightweight by any means, but it's also not the lowest proof in this series.
Right.
And it is, you said, it's very windy. So, and it's landlocked as well. So in many ways, I would almost expect this to go higher in proof over, especially this is, minimum 5 years. So it has some time to get up there, but it seems to have been kept kind of in check, if you will.
Yeah, I think I would have to double check the barrel entry proof, but I think it stays relatively flat over the course of the year, which is interesting.
Very, yeah. I would love to know the fluid dynamics behind that, because that's unusual to say the least. We expect things to go up or down.
Barrel entry proof. This is the nice thing about just putting everything on our website, is that if I forget what something is, I'm just looking at
Right.
Barrel entry proof for it was 110, so it did go up a little bit, but then they're doing a pretty low barrel entry proof.
Yeah,
so that's interesting.
Yeah, 2% a year. That's 110. That's not bad at all. I mean, that's pretty. If I were to guess, they probably got about 4% the first year, and then a little less than 2% each of the subsequent years after that first year. But no, it was very balanced. I agree with you, Nora. It's kind of of the entire line here, I think it was the most classical bourbon palette. At least I would put it next to the Far Flung Bourbon blend. Those two being like the most classic. When you think of bourbon, that's what you might get. But still, coming from Kansas, it's a new thing. There's not a lot of distilleries in Kansas. I mean, there's one very, very, very big one in Kansas, but that's not alcohol that you're necessarily going to drink. There are not a lot of beverage alcohol distilleries in Kansas. It's another one of those states that just is growing. It's got room to grow. It's still growing. Were you surprised that there was no wheat in the mash bill, given that they were in Kansas?
A little bit, especially because they kept reminding me that like I would say things like, there must be a lot of corn growing around here, and they're like, no, it's wheat.
Right.
So a lot of the corn in this all is relatively local, but I think a lot of it actually comes from Missouri. But they're in the Kansas City metro area, so they're like a 15-minute drive from downtown Kansas City, Missouri. But yeah, you would think that there would be
it would be a wheated bourbon.
yeah, and they do play with wheat with some of their whiskeys as well. And I think there are a few other distilleries in Kansas. I think Boot Hill does some wheat whiskey, right? Or at least they play with wheat.
Yeah, they've got a wheat whiskey and a wheated bourbon.
Yeah. But yeah, I think that they I mean, you gotta have a bourbon out there, and especially when it is local grain, and I think it is a very approachable flavor profile too.
Sure. And so just in the interest of time, I'm going to try to get to all of these. We're going to see what we can do. But the next one I want to touch on is going back to a kind of classic state. So Leaper's Fork in Tennessee.
Mhm.
So I did actually, this is one of the, actually, now that I think about it, it's the only one of the single cast, at least, that I've visited.
Mhm.
And I think I spent more time outside on the porch with a cat than I did inside. The cat's just very, very attentive. So Leaper's Fork, it's in Tennessee. It's on kind of the northern side of Tennessee. I believe it was near the state line, because I think I went on the same day as I went to like MB Roland and another one like that in Kentucky. So they are making a Tennessee whiskey. So they use the Lincoln County process in whatever form they choose to use the Lincoln County process. So this is of the of the entire lineup, is the only one that comes from the big five, I would say, distilling states. And I know as you're thinking about it, you probably could have omitted this one if you wanted to and said, we're just going to do states that are underrepresented. But by adding in this Tennessee whiskey doesn't taste anything like Jack or George or Tennessee Distillers Group product. What about Leaper's Fork said, this is a Tennessee whiskey, but it's one you should take a look at?
Yeah, I mean, I think from a Tennessee whiskey, like why we would want to add that last summer. So Summer of Bourbon 1, we had a Kentucky bourbon, and so this time we had a Tennessee whiskey, and so but it was a new riff. It was a totally wild new riff bourbon, like a char 1 barrel new riff as part of Summer Bourbon. So this is Kentucky bourbon or this is Tennessee whiskey, but like a totally new spin on it. You can talk a little bit more about Leaper's Fork specifically, but I think that's worth noting because for us, it's not always about the everything else. Like we love these types of whiskey and we will continue sourcing from these places, but we have to have something interesting to say when we're working with a distillery, especially in these very well-known, beloved regions of the country from a whiskey perspective.
So I think in the case of Leaper's Fork is that they are making the style of whiskey that their state is best known for, Tennessee whiskey, but they're doing it in a very hands-on and traditional manner. This is not like a big factory distillery by any means. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but like, as you say, like it's a distillery with a porch that has a cat. And it's actually one of the prettiest distilleries that I've been to in the country. I think
the grounds are gorgeous.
Yeah.
I was sad I didn't get more time to hang out on the porch because every time I've been there, it's been like torrential rains for some reason. But it's beautiful distillery, half-hour south of Nashville, so like pretty close to like the northern part of the state. And I just don't think that there are that many distilleries that like openly and proudly embrace the tradition of Tennessee whiskey. They make both Lincoln County processed Tennessee whiskey. They also make Tennessee bourbon, but they're proud of the heritage of it. And there's Lee, the founder there, will happily say like Tennessee whiskey is a kind of bourbon, but it's a different kind of bourbon. It has a slightly different flavor profile. The filtration does change it in subtle ways, but I think some people just say reductively like the process removes flavor or something like that. I don't think that's true. It just
Changes
it makes it. I call it like mellow and rounded. And I really like the texture and the mouthfeel of it. And I think that I haven't seen that besides from Tennessee whiskey.
To your knowledge, I mean, what is their version of the Lincoln County process?
To my knowledge, it's that they're doing it right after the distillation in roughly the traditional way.
Okay.
They're not doing anything too unusual with it.
I always think of when you're comparing the distillers they're doing, Jack Daniels has their 10 feet of charcoal, plus the additional 3 feet if you're getting the Gentleman Jack, and then others kind of just like Nelson's Greenbrier that almost it's almost like just rinsing it through charcoal very quickly, very thin layer. So this idea of Lincoln County process, running it through sugar maple charcoal after distillation, is a fairly wide definition. So I'd be curious to know what theirs is, because I agree with you, Adam, in that I initially thought that ELCP was more reductive, that it removed, even if it mellowed things out a little bit, it removed a lot of those oils and flavors and things, just because that's what charcoal does. It filters. Anyone who's used a Brita filter knows that that's what charcoal does. It filters. So when brands use a little bit less of the charcoal and really just kind of take out some of those fusel oils on the edges that are a little, either burny or a little too hot in some way, I know I find them really, I know keep using the word interesting. I'm trying to find a different word, but that's just what keeps coming up. I find it interesting in the sense that just like bourbon in general, as long as it's 51% corn and a couple other things, new oak and such, there's a huge range of things you can do with it. So when you look at a Tennessee whiskey, this is not going to remind you of Jack or George or even other small Tennessee distilleries like Greenbrier and others. So yeah, when I visited, I think the distillation was all in a barn, right? It was a converted barn.
Yeah.
So not huge, not massive stills. They're not putting out hundreds of thousands of gallons LPAs. But I do think Lieber's Fork has a little bit more, let's say, awareness. There's a little bit more awareness of them than, let's say, Highwire or Rocktown, or certainly a Ghost Distillery like Mississippi Memory, or I should say Ghost Distillery like Rich Grain Distilling. So with Lieber's Fork, do you think they have more just by nature of it's close to Nashville, people can visit it easily, and it's part of the kind of Tennessee Distillers Trail?
I think it's because that it's in Tennessee, and that a lot of people like us, like Nora and I, like you, like Cumming Whiskey, like people like that, just happen to have been there and have gotten really excited by it, because you just said they're not that big, but from the beginning they've invested in doing everything right. Like it's always been full-size barrels. The reason we tried really hard to get barrels from them for the first Summer of Bourbon, I wanted to have both a Kentucky and Tennessee whiskey. And I had a really good conversation with Lee, the founder, about it. He ultimately was like, you know what, I just don't think that this is quite ready for you yet. And I was like, I think it's amazing, but if that's what you think, respect. Like he wanted it to have another year on it before we and be able to give me what was the age statement on ours? It's a
5, I think.
Maybe it might have just turned 6, I forget.
I think it's 5 on the label, whether or not it had a birthday or not. Sometimes bias.
But he wanted to make sure that if he was putting it out to an audience that was going to be noticed beyond his backyard, that it would be like the best possible representation of them. And we respect that. So I think that's helped them gain a quick reputation for quality, but they're still only available in Tennessee, except for like occasionally on Sealbox or something like that. So
but it's notable that on the West Coast, I do our California sales, no one had heard of them. Like I think it might still be East Coast, like a lot of these where people know all about them on one side of the country and nothing on the other. That it's on the East Coast, like popping down to Nashville is more likely to happen than if you're all the way out in California.
Yeah, I think things don't really seem to hit the West Coast unless they're from the West Coast. They don't seem to hit there unless they get into either K&L or the wine store in San Francisco. I'm forgetting the name, but the big one there that's also just kind of make or break in terms of notoriety. So no, I agree. Lieber's Fork, definitely worth the try as well. Oh man, the time is going quickly. This is so for listeners, this is I said to Adam and Nora before we started recording, this is my first interview that we're doing after the baby's been born. So you all are my guinea pigs for getting back in the swing of things, and you've been wonderful in bearing with me as we jump around. As you know, I'm usually more structured with these, but when you've got so many things to talk about and so many great products, like, there wasn't um a what is the word I'm looking for? My God.
Not a bad one or something like that.
Yeah, like not a bad one in the bunch. Yeah. Um, yeah, I really could not think of the word. Not not a couldn't think of the word bad. That's pretty bad. There's not a bad one in the bunch. Like everything in here is going to be interesting. But I think for me, I just naturally gravitated. Let's try that again. Jesus Christ. I almost feel like this needs a blooper reel. Um, so I naturally gravitated towards the smaller, less known ones because they're just, to me, that's where it gets. I get the most excited about what I'm drinking. Um, I do want to just hit on, Woodinville it's from Washington. It's a straight bourbon, 116.9 proof, 6 years minimum. Woodinville's fairly well known. It's one of those West Coast ones that is well known on the East Coast and everything in between. Now, a lot, brands and independent bottlers and groups have done picks with them. So they took off right during that sticker phase before and during the beginning of COVID. So they got a lot of notoriety there. They were also an early partner with Pursuit, Bourbon Pursuit. So they got a lot of barrels out there and it really helped get their name out. So they may be the most well-known of the single cask series of this group.
That's right. Yeah. They now slightly edged out New Riff as the biggest distillery that we've worked with. Woodinville is quite sizable and putting down a lot of whiskey. But the interesting thing is they don't have a regular cask strength expression that's available outside of Washington. So sometimes there can be barrel picks and things like that. But they do a lot of really interesting and unique finishes that do get out there. But for cask strength, you just don't see it as often as I want it anyway.
Yeah. For an example of the of those cask finishes, I'm forgetting the name. It was a very odd one, but as you mentioned, Cumming Whiskey, he went there as well and came back. I think the bottle broke in transit, unfortunately, but it was some barrel finish that I'd never heard of. Started with a G and
a Guignol wine finish, which
is like Guignol wine.
Is wine of some type that I had never heard of before either.
Yeah, and totally new, and that's just cool. Whenever there's a new finish or something, whenever VDN came on, there was that, and then Amburana, everyone wants to try that. God help us. And I'm very happy the Amburana phase seems to be dying down a bit. There's just way too much cinnamon everywhere. But anyway, so back to Woodinville. So as you said, it's a large distillery.
Yeah.
I mean, New Riff, you said it's a comparison. New Riff is pretty big. They're putting out over the 100,000 mark, I believe, per year in LPAs, not barrels, but LPAs, and which is, it's for craft, that's huge. And to have someone outstrip them is, I think, equally impressive. So with Woodinville, because they had a reputation, because they were pretty well known, even as I said, Adam, they don't have the cask strength regular releases available outside of Washington or outside of barrel picks. This is a brand that, for people who may be fans of Lost Lantern or fans of whiskey in general, they may have known about them. So it's not like you were introducing them. It may be a reintroduction, unlike some of the other ones on this list that are just brand new to people. So when you have a distillery like that has some more notoriety, that people may have had more than one taste of before, how do you go about thinking, what's the right reintroduction? What's the right thing that's going to be different than something they've had before from this distillery?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective in California, it's been the cask strength thing. So a lot of the stores that we sell to, a lot of the people that we talk to have had it not at cask strength, and they have generally, there are exceptions where people have done barrel picks for it, but by and large, it's wanting to taste, loving it at the proof that it's at, but really wanting access to and also the underlying spirit. So there's a lot of finishes out there. So tasting the straight bourbon at cask strength is something that people get excited about for a distillery that they love, where it's not as like out there as some of the stuff that we've done with Balcones, which is another of our core distillery partners that is relatively well known. But I think for Woodinville, it's been surprising to me how many consumers don't know Woodinville. Like, I think that that we do in the industry and buyers at stores really know them, but when we pour at festivals, people are just as likely to know one of the other distilleries as Woodinville, in my experience, which has been
Really?
surprising. Yeah.
Yeah, that's consistent for us, even with distilleries where I'm like, everybody has heard of Balcones or Westland. I forget that everybody is like our world of people who live this all the time, but even there are people who are pretty serious whiskey drinkers who just may not have encountered that yet.
People at the Seattle festival that spent $150 on a ticket to a whiskey festival and didn't know Westland. Like, obviously a ton of people do, but there are also enough people at a festival like that in their hometown that didn't know it, that it's for us, it's always a reminder that our core customer right now is like the uber nerd, is the highly educated, like, thinks about this. Yeah, you are exactly that.
Yep.
Whiskey podcast that started for fun.
Right.
And
And even without changing our message or how we're getting into stores, they're like the next tier down, still educated, but not like as nerdy. Even a place like Woodinville, they've probably not heard of. They're super interested and they want to explore it, but they haven't heard of that yet. So we're starting through these collections to speak to both groups. Still like very engaged, educated, but there are two different levels of true knowledge when it comes to the craft movement. So yeah, that's how I think about it.
I just brought up an interesting question. You said excuse me, Woodinville is, sorry. I think my voice just reached its limit. So Woodinville is now the largest partner that you've worked with by output volume.
Yep.
to my knowledge, maybe New Riff has gotten bigger since I last visited, but like they're certainly like pretty.
Those are the two. Yeah.
I'm curious if you have I know this would be super arbitrary, but I'm curious if you have an upper limit to like how big someone can be for you to work with.
Nope.
No, the rule is that we have to be able to do the selection process the way we do it with everything else, which is that like we get to pick the barrels before, well, we get to try the barrels before you buy them, which like if you're a Scotch independent bottler is often not true.
True.
We get to visit the distillery in person and meet with usually like either the founder or the head distiller or like someone in a senior role. And that we're never going to pick the barrel on site. Like we even at Woodinville, where they normally do have people coming for barrel picks and picking on site, we're like, can I bottle these up and take them home and taste them in our neutral facility where I'm not surrounded by all the romance of your Portuguese cherry liqueur barrel, which is what it is. I looked it up. It's not a Portuguese wine, it's a Portuguese cherry liqueur. And then we
everything tastes better at the distillery. Everything.
Yeah. And then we have to be able to put the name on the label. So like we would work with one of the very large Kentucky or Tennessee distilleries at some point, if we can do it the same way that we do everything else. And if we think we have something of value to add, like even if they would let us do it, but it's just like, it's like an extra barrel, same as anybody else is getting, then that's not that interesting. But if we get something cool and weird from a big place, then that would be fine.
Makes
pretty
sense.
Cool.
So the last two we've got on the list, so Corbin Cash in California,
which is very sold out, so we don't have to spend a ton of time on that one if you don't want to.
Fair enough.
Yeah, that's sold out in a day across like both retail and online. Yeah.
I would bet, given how the response was to the Corbin Cash rye that came out. I mean, I kind of figured that one was going to go pretty quickly. So we'll just say the stats on it because it's worth mentioning. This was the real heavy hitter of the group, the heavyweight, 146.2 proof, 7 years old minimum. So they do seem like a distillery though that is not, they're not a huge distillery by any means with a ton of distribution, and yet they have this very dedicated clientele and interest group. So did you kind of expect that it was going to go just as quickly based on how the rye had gone.
Yes.
Yeah.
Especially this one. For the first rye cask, we didn't know because I think they do have that really intense following, but I think that's developed relatively recently. I think they got some really good coverage from Breaking Bourbon about 2 years ago, and I think
our stuff.
maybe we helped a little bit too.
I mean, our first cask of their rye was a finalist for best rye at San Francisco, so that also put them on the map. That it was of that caliber. Yeah.
Just that at some point, like if the product is amazing and people are getting their hands on it, and like people who have an audience get to try it, then word starts to spread. And I think that's happened with them.
Yeah. And well deserved. I mean, it's delicious whiskey across the board. So it's one of our team, their rye is one of our team, not just the two of us, but like our entire company team favorites from our rye portfolio.
Well deserved. I agree. It's great stuff. It's different. They're known for sweet potato vodka and sweet potato spirits. I think that's the official name of the distillery, like sweet potato. So which is why I couldn't find them at first. I was searching Corbin Cash, and it kept coming up with the sweet potato thing. I was like, that can't be the same thing, right? But nope, that's there we are.
Yeah.
So the last one here, I do want to just touch on it. The Boulder Spirits Armagnac finished Colorado straight bourbon single cask. And then I have one more question for you as well that goes to something you said about Corbin Cash. So the Boulder Spirits, as I said, I have the bottle of the peated hazmat. I think it was 149 proof. That was you need to work up to that one, I would say.
Yes, you do.
Both the peat level and the proof level. You got to prep yourself a little bit for that one, or you're not going to taste anything for 2 days. But if you work that way up, it's worth it. It's gonna be great. This one was a little bit more moderated, which you can't say often for 125.5 proof, but it was a little more moderate. Minimum 7-year aged, 300 bottles, so slightly larger output than the normal, about 150 to 200. And I'm guessing this was because it was finished in the Armagnac, so you had a larger barrel to work with.
Yeah.
Right. So with this, the question I wanted to ask was, how did you go about choosing which Armagnac you wanted to finish it in?
So we didn't finish it. They did.
Oh, they did. Okay.
They finished it. And this is one of those cases where we didn't know to ask for it. In fact, you got a phone call. Do you want to?
Yeah, I'll text.
A text. Okay, fine. No cold call.
Texting relationship with distilleries now. As you know, they're a pretty regular partner of ours. They're the only Colorado distillery we've worked with to date, and we've done a number of things with them. And their head blender / head everything person, Ryan, we call him their head Ryan for short, and reached out and said, hey, we have a single cask that was finished in Armagnac. We only really have one. I think it's really good, and we kind of don't feel like doing a cola and a label and all that stuff for it. It's like we are very well set up to do a individual unique label for something that has just one cask and will not be continuing like release ongoing. Other places are not set up to do that easily. They can do it, but it takes a while, and it's
expensive.
It's expensive. Yeah. It's a pain. And for us, it was easy. And we said, okay, send us a sample, and we can maybe do it as our first ever finished bourbon, which is exactly what we did. We thought it was great. And we like that they did the finish. We're starting to explore a little bit with experimenting with finishes in-house. Spoiler alert.
Wink, wink.
But we will always continue to do finishes that were already done by the distillery, because we're interested in those are the people who know the whiskey better than anyone else ever will. And what they choose to pair it with is always really interesting to us, especially when it's something more unusual.
And I love myself an Armagnac finish. The second pick I ever did for my own group was an Armagnac finish. So, and I just like Armagnac straight. So it definitely worth, again, I loved it. So
yeah. Well, it's 2.5 years in an Armagnac cask. So that Armagnac, you're not gonna miss it. There's no subtle finishing to this finish. Right. This is going to be there, and I love it. I mean, for us, we were 2.5 years sounds like a lot. And honestly, when we first got the specs, I was like, I don't know, man. Like, I don't know if I can do this. But we tasted it, and it was like, oh, this is a real marriage. I think some finishes enhance the underlying spirit in a way that is almost subtle, and you don't even totally know what's going on there. This is you taste the Armagnac, you taste the bourbon, and I think it's wonderful synergy, but it that is a very finished bourbon.
Yeah, 2.5 years anywhere is a lot of
Yeah.
time. I mean, at that point, it's almost verging on what I would prefer to call like a secondary maturation. I think if it gets past like 18 months to a 2 year point, that's to me, that's secondary. So when this says 7 years, it's 7 year bourbon that's then finished for 2.5 years, or it's total.
Total.
So,
Total.
even more so than I would almost think like secondary maturation in these Armagnac casks is so much time in there. So again, there's so much more to go into, and you guys are nothing if not transparent to the furthest extent that you can possibly be transparent. So all the information is on the website for specs that were not mentioned here, for all these products and everything else that is available. I did want in the last just minute or two to ask this question of you, and I don't think I've asked it in the previous interviews, and if I have, please go with me on this, which is, the outturn on a lot of these, especially the single casks, is not huge. I mean, even the outturn on the single distillery series or the blend series, you're talking 500 to 700-ish barrels on those, and we're talking really closer to 200 on most of the single cask series. Now, as you mentioned with the Corbin Cash, with the rye, you did enter it into San Francisco, and some of these do get entered for awards, and to your credit, if they enter, they usually win or get pretty damn close. They're getting gold, double gold. You're not pulling in less than that, it seems. So when you have such a low outturn and not a lot to work with, these products, some of them are going to sell out before even the tasters at the competition get to try them. How do you go about choosing which products are going to be entered into competition?
A good question.
It is a good question. I mean, it's evolved over time. One of the reasons why we entered the Corbin Cash is we didn't think it was going to sell out immediately. We thought there was a chance that the quality is so high that we expected that it would do well. We didn't expect that it would be a finalist, but for single cast, it's usually either a larger single cast or one that we think that is amazing, but it won't necessarily, for whatever reason, draw attention. And it helps us with potentially showing people, yeah, this is as good as we're saying. It's a second voice saying this is amazing, or a third voice, or whatever. For the single distillery series and the blends, we do usually have enough for those that by the time the results come out, we'll still have some. And if we don't think we will, we generally now no longer submit it. So like right now, the World Whiskies Awards are open for submission, and we're debating if we even submit stuff this year because we're worried that the things that we could submit would be sold out by the time it comes out. There's also for us, honestly, wanting to show consistency. So being able to show that we are consistently winning awards or getting double golds or getting high scores as an independent bottler, maintaining trust in the quality level, even as we're growing, as we're doing more things, as we're going into additional states, those help us signal consistency of quality. So it's also like when it comes down to like how we think of it on a broader scale, that's why even if something's sold out, getting a double gold or a best in class or whatever is still valuable to the brand at large. Although we try to not
distillery too.
And that's true. And to the distillery because they get the credit because their whiskey is really good. But we're trying not to frustrate people by submitting something that is going to be long gone. But we sometimes, like with Mississippi Memory, we thought that was 3 months at least of inventory. It was how many bottles? 500, 600 bottles? I can't remember right now. We thought it was going to last for
500, yeah.
And it sold out in like 2 hours online and like maybe 2 days in store. So sometimes something speaks to people in a way that we don't anticipate, and we do our best, but those are the things where it's like, okay, great, like amazing, we love this, you love this too, we'll do more of this, but sometimes it's not predictable for us on the inside as we're blending stuff.
Yeah.
Awesome. And I had one more question on the awards that just went right out of my head, so I'll think of it 2:00 in the morning when
I'm sure
up for some reason, but and I'll reach out. But just Adam and Nora, thank you both for coming back on. I always love talking to you guys about your releases and your thought processes, and because it's not the same the question is not the same thought processes for everything. So there's always something new to talk about, new distilleries to highlight and get people to try. And I have the utmost respect for you guys for doing that and for lifting the veil on and shining a light as you would on these craft distilleries around the country. So as of recording, and this should go out pretty quickly, there are still bottles available of several, the cask series, the blend series, Mississippi Memory. Sorry, that one is a memory for the moment.
Yep.
But and the Corbin Cash as well. But you'll still be able to find others. And honestly, there are still bottles from previous releases that are available. My personal favorite that's still on there that I just got a bottle of myself was the Mountain Meadow from St. George. I love that bottle, so unique. And my episode with St. George should be coming out shortly after this as well. So very interesting, just fun guys to talk to. Also the most cursing I think I've ever had in an episode. But anyway,
that checks out. You had both Lance and Dave?
Yeah.
Yeah, that combo is a recipe for amazingness and disaster all at the same time. So
I think the only potential guest that I could have on that might beat them is if I had Fred No on, and that's a dream for another day. But
I feel like I am pretty good. The secret is that I probably swear as much as Dave and Lance do it. So not on podcasts. I have been media trained by my lovely husband to not be dropping F-bombs all of the time. So yeah.
Oh, fun. Come on. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. But no, always thank you for coming on. You're always, the door's always open for you to talk about the new products you got. I look forward to what's the next release batch that you've got going, if you can tell us.
Yeah, we're can I tell?
Not what it is, but you can say generally when it will be.
It'll be in the late fall. We normally do a September release. We are not doing a traditional September release this year, although we are going to do some fun things to encourage people to explore beyond their comfort zone.
Because of a birthday for one of the whiskeys that we're releasing in our fall collection. So we're more info on that, but we're waiting for a very, very auspicious birthday. So we're doing, if this will be coming out in time. If it does, we have some fun things happening in September that we've never done before, but not whiskey release related.
Yeah, that'll be more like early November.
Next release. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you both for coming on. Hang on with me for just a second. This has been another episode of the Whiskey Ring Podcast, a bonus episode. Please go to Lost Lantern Whiskey, check them out. Get on their lists so you know when things are coming out. So when the next Corbin Cash barrel comes, you might have a chance at it. When the next release of some stuff from Rich Grain Distilling comes out, you might have a chance. And of course, all these other products. So with that, thank you all for listening, and I'll see you all next week.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thanks.